Welcome back. Good afternoon and welcome to all of you joining us here in person and also online. Thank you so much for joining us at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum President's Day Festival. I'm Kennedy Library Forum producer Liz Murphy, and I am delighted to welcome our distinguished guests for today's Town Hall press conference. Second President John Adams is kindly here with us today, as well as First Lady Abigail Adams, and I'm also delighted to introduce our 16th President, Abraham Lincoln. We are all looking forward to your questions today. If you're joining us here in person, please feel free to come up to the microphones in the two aisles here. If you're joining us online, please email your questions to jfkpresidentsday@nara.gov. That's N National, A Archives, R Records, A Administration.gov. And we'll make sure to get to as many of your questions as we can during this press conference. And now, I'm absolutely delighted to kick off the conference. If anyone has any early questions, please do come up to the mics. And perhaps as we're waiting for our first question or two, would any of our distinguished guests today have any quick words of wisdom they'd like to share with our audience?
That there is no finer government than that which is representative of the people.
My words of wisdom, perhaps if we mean to have heroes and statesmen and philosophers, then we ought to have learned women. We ought to have equal education and the betterment of every individual to become, manifest themselves into their full state. And so if you are hoping to have good, solid citizens who will serve your country and do honor and pride to your nation, then you might as well educate every single young person in the nation as best you can to give them the tools to succeed that way.
Hear, hear.
Well, I guess for me, the thing that comes to my mind is history is philosophy teaching by example. And if we look at the history of this country and compare it to that of other countries, we see something markedly different. And I remember when I was a boy, I got hold of a little book, probably such a one as none of you have ever seen. It was called Parson Weems' Life of General George Washington. And I remember reading of the terrible struggles that those people went through and thinking, there must have been something more than common that those people were suffering for. Something more than just separating the colonies from the motherland. And that set me on a course to try to figure out what was the philosophy behind the history. I'm not going to tell you what I learned. Because I want you to do the same thing.
Well put.
Lots to think about there. Thanks to all of you. And please don't be shy. Please come on up and join us at the aisle mics. If you've got a question, you're here with us in person, please do send in your questions online if you're joining us online. I do have a quick question from an online viewer that came in just after our last town hall press conference. It is aimed at President Lincoln. President Lincoln, why do you insist on so often wearing an enormously tall stovepipe top hat in public, despite already being so very tall yourself and towering over most people?
Simple. Mrs. Lincoln makes me. The long answer to the question is that's the style. And Mrs. Lincoln is very meticulously vigilant about keeping me in style. You notice there is not a single cat hair on me anymore. She thoroughly brushed me before I left. I told her that if you just brush the cat, you won't have nearly as much trouble, but she doesn't do that.
Well, it is true, if you don't mind. I know the question was asked of you, Mr. Lincoln, but it is so important for somebody in an important, well-observed office, like President of the United States, or any elected office,
Indeed,
that people are going to be looked to, that you should look presentable, respectable.
You're sounding like Mrs. Lincoln.
I am, and I would say I would never. I am a bit shocked that I have let Mr. Adams go on stage without a hat. This is a public forum, after
I'm
all.
just thinking of Europe, how we had to put up pretenses in Europe, how we had to dress. King's levees, whether it was King Louis XVI or King George III, and the whole business of not only being immaculately dressed and coiffed and the like, but learning all of the mannerisms, which is why from my vice presidency on through retirement, I was accused by some of being a monarchist, when I simply explained it was what had to be done then and at the time. Imagine a farmer from Braintree having to learn how to do this 3 times before having an audience with the king, King George III. 3 times, from entrance to the chamber, to the halfway point, to in front of his presence. And imagine this as an Adams, not being able to speak until spoken to. You have not had to meet a monarch, I would assume.
Thank you so much for that spirited discussion. And I wonder if we could expand on that a little bit, actually. What an interesting thing to transition from being a private citizen to being the President or the First Lady of the United States. What was that like for each of you?
Well, of course, my experience was a little bit different because I was a farmer citizen, a son of a farmer in Braintree, and went on to government at a local and colony level, and then on to the Congress. And it would separate us for a great deal of that time. That was the most difficult part of it. But when I returned home, the new government was being formed after the ratification of the Constitution, and I assumed that I would be a part of it, which brought me to being vice president, which is another conversation we can have all together, and the worthlessness of the position. But going on from being vice president to president, it was less about my transition becoming vice president or president, and more from going from these shores to Europe. That was where my eyes were opened.
Similar for me, though I'd say there was still a strong moment of an anxious threshold about to be crossed, I suppose I should say, just before your inauguration, or when the prospect of perhaps Mr. Adams winning the presidency and us being asked to serve as the first couple of the nation, the idealized example, I suppose, of what Americans ought to be. Of course, not everyone is going to completely imitate the president and the president's wife, but they do look to you as examples of virtues and morality and steadfastness and patriotism and what it means to be American, the American identity, and so that is an incredible amount of pressure to put on an individual. And I myself was never raised for public light in any means. I should say, as being raised as a woman, I was not raised to be in the public sphere. And the expectations of women in my time were really to live within the domestic space, to be in charge of the household, of the children, raising the family, educating of the small ones, nursing the family, getting past sickness and illness, taking care of the elderly. Those things all happen in a private sphere. So being called upon to be so very in the public eye was frankly terrifying for me. Yeah. And I was quite worried as well about losing the freedom of my own words. I like to speak my mind, and when you're in the privacy of your own home, you may speak your mind as much as you may. When you're being watched by a nation, you really should be more careful with your words than perhaps I had
Indeed.
been. And so that adjustment, feeling that I needed to censor myself, to quiet Abigail so that Mrs. President would be able to speak through. That was quite an adjustment. And frankly, something that I am grateful I only had to do for 4 years. It could have been a lot worse.
My advice, never suggest as vice president that the president be called His Majesty the President. Just words to live by.
Well, I was elected, I think, in such a difficult time with division being so dominant that I had like 44% of the vote, and if the Democratic Party hadn't split, I wouldn't have been elected. And so I faced opposition for that reason, but also my schooling didn't amount to a single year formal schooling. I was from the western regions. Nobody had been elected from so far west before. I was considered an inept prairie lawyer. And there are just so many counts against my success. And the death threats were constant even before the election culminated, and those were difficult things to adjust to, but particularly for Mrs. Lincoln. But I discovered that for all of my simplicities and backwardness, there was a sense that I was in the right place at the right time, and my native abilities were able to come to the fore, much of which I learned on the prairie circuit, what we called the old eighth judicial, just working with people so much throughout my life, trained me for the heady business of working in Washington politics. Because, you know, people are people. No matter where they live, they have the same kinds of motives and the same kinds of faults. And once you understand human nature, you can sort through a lot of things that at first glance might seem a little overweening. But so I learned as I went, essentially. And I made a lot of mistakes.
Thank you all. We've got just about 10 minutes left with our distinguished guests, and I want to make sure we're getting to all of your questions. Does anyone in this room have a question? If so, could you, please, feel free to run up to this mic. Thank you.
Step forward, sir.
Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. Sort of plays on what you both were just talking about. My last visit to Mount Vernon, and I got an opportunity to really sort of learn more about George Washington than really I think I had before. It struck me as a general, he lost many more battles than he actually won. But yet we look at George Washington, history proves to him to be a great president, a great general, a great leader, a great backbone to our country. Both of you as presidents are also considered great, presidents, great men, backbones of our country. But can talk about how you dealt with resiliency, especially given the oppositions that you had, the challenges that you had, and maybe the failures that, were also part of your presidential experience?
Certainly. Well, my resiliency is sitting to my left. Because without her, I could do nothing, as I wrote to her many times in Europe and at home. When we were talking about presidential mistakes, I've already told you of my vice presidential mistake. My presidential mistake initially was maintaining the last cabinet of President Washington, all of whom were under the control of a certain retired secretary as puppet master in New York, named Alexander Hamilton, as if I needed to tell you. Well, that little man from New York gave them instructions to the point where these gentlemen, Mr. Pickering, Mr. McHenry, and Mr. Wolcott, were sending him information for him to tell them how to respond and not telling me anything, such as who should command the army in our undeclared war against France, the half-war, to defend these shores. I was constantly having to debate with them what was the right course, to the point where I grew tired of it. I realized I should have dismissed them, and I realized that the other party, Mr. Jefferson's party, my vice president, by the way, were working against me as well. My resiliency as president and my will and determination were bound on the fact that I knew that I was doing what I thought was best for this country, keeping us out of an unnecessary war, despite clamor for it, trying to balance between the two parties and trying to be independent of them, which proved very unfruitful. And as my frustrations grew with trying to keep this country out of an unnecessary war, the one I leaned on more and more was my beloved Mrs. Adams. I could have done none of this without her by my side, and you can look up my presidential record and see that my mistakes as vice president and then as president, such as the naming of the president, such as my attempts to reach out to Mr. Jefferson, Mr. Madison, and their friends, were done without the company of my dear lady. There is my resiliency.
Well, I didn't have that advantage. Mrs. Lincoln was perhaps, life in Washington was more difficult than she or I had imagined. I found that I had to find resilience in perhaps less lofty places. You know, some of the best things in life are your friends. And when I got to Washington, I had to find people that I knew I could be open and honest with. William Henry Seward, was one of those people. And I developed some close friendships, some of them from Illinois, some from Washington. I also had to deal with my own feelings, anger at times over frustrating experiences with generals. I tried to give every general at least 6 months a chance to prove themselves, but I was without answers very often, and sometimes I knew nowhere else to go except to my knees. At times of great stress, I would go to theater just to get my mind off of it. I learned as a boy, I had a bow and arrow that I made, and I discovered that if you leave it strung, it loses its resilience. And that for it needs periods of rest in which it's unstrung. And I needed that. And sometimes when the battles seemed hopeless and it seemed like we were going to lose everything, I would go to theater every night. And an old friend of mine came to visit one time, and he noticed that I have 2 books on my desk. One is the collected works of William Shakespeare, and the other is my mother's Bible. And Mr. Speed, my friend from Kentucky, commented on that, and I said, Speed, I have discovered that referring to the Bible is the best cure for the blues. And so those have been my sources of solace and consolation, and I find that if I stay strong, I can help my wife as well. If I don't, we're in a terrible mess.
I just use books to voice my opinion.
I was going to say, in terms of resilience, this isn't a cure or a fix. It didn't make it any easier to be resilient, but I'm certain that anyone in this room who has contended with hard times or with a traumatic event, a great loss, a destruction of one's own personal life, that the heart does keep beating somehow, even if you feel you cannot go on. Your body almost betrays you. Your lungs will continue to fill with air. Somehow, tomorrow morning, this unimaginable time, tomorrow morning, when you're dealing with strife and loss and grief and anxiety, it will come. It will come. And chances are you will be there for it. And you can't stop that from happening. And so the resilience is, in fact, the continuation of your own existence. It will keep going. And you will figure out what to do in the moment. Again, not to fix things, a solution, a cure, that's not what comes from it, but you will find what the moment will be when the moment comes. And the moment is coming.
Bravo.
Thank you all. Thank you for the question. We have enough time for one more very brief question, if anyone in the audience has one. I do if you don't. Last call.
Anyone?
Presidents and First Lady, if we might consider this a lightning round question, because we are just about at time.
You're telling me to be brief, aren't you?
Is there anything about life in the presidency or in the White House that you found surprising? Anything that you really liked or anything that you really hated?
Surprising? Well, I was vice president beforehand. I can't think of anything surprising, except in a disappointed light that I had set myself to be president to be a party of none, and that would prove not to be the case.
I should say something that I surprisingly found I did enjoy about being the wife of the president was being at the center of information. When you live in the house of the president, you get a lot of the most breaking news from the best reputable sources, and it's right there. And I, as somebody who is always craving knowledge and learning, reading, and consuming as much of that information as possible, I really did enjoy those moments when I was set right there in the hub to witness and have all of the gossip.
Well, I guess for me, the most surprising thing on my first day in the White House was that the furnace didn't work.
Well, when we lived in the presidential mansion, it wasn't finished yet. We had to leave the fireplace running so that the plaster on the walls would dry out in time.
Well, fortunately, the plaster was dry by the time I got there.
President Lincoln, President Adams, Mrs. Adams, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm so sorry we're out of time for this session. Thanks to all of you for the great questions, all of you for the great answers. In about 10 minutes, right in this room, one of my colleagues will be leading the Presidential Fitness Challenge, which is a lot of fun. I did the morning session. And I think you all know to check your brochure for the full schedule of activities and crafts we have throughout the afternoon. Thanks again for joining us, and enjoy your day. Thank you.